Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies and at the National University of Singapore. I'm Gyanesh Kudaisya, Associate Professor at the Institute, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Today's podcast is focused on South Asian geopolitics, particularly looking at the changing dynamic between India and her neighbors. Joining us today is Professor S.D. Muni, Professor Emeritus at the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and a former Indian ambassador to Laos and special envoy of the Government of India to Southeast Asian countries. Professor Muni has just published a new book called Dabbling in Diplomacy, Authorised and Otherwise, Reflections of a Non-Career Diplomat. And he shall be talking to us initially about his book, particularly keeping in mind his deep involvement with India's diplomatic efforts in Nepal and Sri Lanka. In the later part of the podcast, we shall also talk to him about contemporary developments relating to geopolitics in the South Asian region. Professor Muni, thank you for joining us. Please tell our listeners about the book, especially its title, and why did you write it?
Well, the title, as you see, is Authorized and Otherwise, Dabbling in Diplomacy. Diplomacy was not my profession, but somehow destiny pushed me into it, both formal and informal. And that's why I say it authorized and otherwise. And I call it Recollections of a non-official or, a kind of a political appointee, because there is a huge cleavage between those who are official professional diplomats and those who enter diplomacy occasionally, like me, who are outside it. But in JNU, the institute which I taught, we have a unique relationship with diplomacy. We used to train diplomats, and before the Indian Foreign Service was established, all the professionals would come to us for about 6 weeks or a little more than that. Then we also host diplomats, because many diplomats who want to remain in Delhi in search of new appointment come to us as visiting professors. And there was a formal arrangement between JNU and MEA. I don't know if that arrangement still exists, where we hosted them. And thirdly, we also contributed. I am not the only one who was taken from JNU in diplomacy. There were 4 others also. Before me were Sisir Gupta, who first went to Vietnam, then to Spain, I think. Then there was Professor Bimal Prasad, who went to Nepal for 2 terms. Then I was there, and after me also there have been 2 other colleagues who were chosen as diplomats. So we are somewhere on the borderline of professional diplomacy and in academic diplomacy, put it this way. That's why I put the title as it. The purpose of this was really, I was avoiding to write it, as I have written in my preface, because you come across many events which, if you sit down and recollect, may be pleasant, may be not pleasant to the people whom you have been interacting with. And I never maintained a regular diary. So I thought it is better to avoid sitting down. But a lot of my students and my colleagues, whom I used to narrate the anecdotes of my experience in diplomacy, both formal and informal, they said, put it down for posterity. I have now crossed 80 years, so I thought it is time, maybe last leg of my life, and why not I leave something for my students, as they were suggesting me. That was the purpose of writing the book. So you have the first chapter, which tells you how the academic career of mine got slipped into diplomacy back and forth. And it is very interesting that I have served under 3 different political regimes. I was appointed by a hodgepodge of Janata government led by Gujral, Indra Kumar Gujral, as the ambassador. And he was soon, his government was soon out of power. BJP came in its place. So I submitted my resignation. Though the then president who briefed me before going to Vientiane as an ambassador, that I need not resign if such an emergency comes up. But I thought it was unethical on my part to stay on to this post. But Atal Bihari Vajpayee insisted that I must stay on the post and leave only if the government asks me to do something which is not acceptable to my conscience. So I continued to serve the NDA government. And then I left. But after living 3, 4 years, again the MEA called me to become a special envoy to Southeast Asia to carry forward the cause of India's permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, because the issue at that time was of reforming the UNSC, and special envoys were sent by India to various parts, and this is the region I was chosen for. So I served as a special envoy for another 2 years or so, where I even represented foreign minister at the Cambodian anniversary conference. So these were the reasons why they're there. But during my academic work, both in Nepal and Sri Lanka, as also in other South Asian countries, Bhutan, even Maldives, Pakistan, somehow I happened to run into key decision makers there, and we talked about diplomatic relations. So that I call as an otherwise diplomacy, where I was not expected to do anything, but somehow the destiny pushed me into it. So that is explained in my first chapter. Then I have 2 chapters on Nepal. One during their democratic struggle against the king and the panchayat system, and the second chapter of the mainstreaming of the Maoists, where in both these cases I had little bit of active participation, and I wanted to come to the light as to what it was and why it was there. And then there is a chapter on Sri Lanka. There again, it was almost destiny. Chandrika was a friend of mine before she became president. She even visited JNU as a guest professor for about 15 days when I was head of the South Asian department. And I had met her in Norway in a conference, and then we became friends. So when she became president, my involvement in Sri Lanka became much more, and I became more interested, and in a way taking a closer view of how the Sri Lankan politics emerged. I was interested in Sri Lanka even earlier as being a South Asian teacher when Urmila Fadnis, who was our Sri Lanka expert, used to work very hard on it. I wrote a couple of joint papers with her, but unfortunately she expired in 1989. And then I took more and more interest in Sri Lankan affairs. So the third chapter is on that. Fourth one is on my diplomatic assignment in Vientiane. And the fifth one is on my diplomatic assignment as a special envoy. In the last chapter, I underlined some of the lessons which I learned out of this experience, which was not chosen by me. I never even wanted to become a diplomat, but somehow there were pleasant lessons, there were unpleasant lessons. I have many people who don't like me in South Asia. I have many people who have a lot of goodwill for me also in South Asia. So it has been a great fun in terms of my career and my life. And I call this book as a slice of my career and my life. And I am thankful to all those who helped me to get this transition back and forth.
Thank you so much. That provides a wonderful insight into how the book came about. And of course, our listeners will be, of course, looking forward to delving into the book. I greatly enjoyed it. Now one of the insights which your book offers is about the political dynamics and developments in Nepal relating to the end of constitutional monarchy and the rise of the Maoists and eventually their coming to power. You talk uh, about the mainstreaming of the Maoists and their gradual acceptance by the Indian political establishment, especially the role which you played in the process. Can you please tell our listeners about it?
See, Maoist, my Nepal contact was because my PhD was on Nepal, and I call Nepal as my first academic love. And as everybody knows, the first love never leaves you, even if you want to. So Nepal has never left me, and I have never left Nepal in one way or the other. So during my academic course, I ran into a young boy called Baburam Bhattarai and his wife Hisila Yami, who Rishikesh Shah, a very senior politician of Nepal, introduced me to them. He was never my student, though there is a lot of misperception in Nepal that I taught Baburam and Baburam was my student, which is not really true. In fact, I have learned a lot of politics from Baburam about Nepal. And he once came home and he joined Maoist. You know, he has had a very mercurial character in terms of his evolution of personality. He was a very serious student. He was a worker. He always wanted to help poorer in Nepal. And he had a PhD degree from Nepal, from India on Nepal. And then he joined the human rights movement in Nepal, and then somehow got frustrated and then joined the Maoist and there's a long history which is written in the book. And we joined. So when one day he came to me and said, "Sir, people are calling us terrorists. We are not really terrorists. We have a political mission and we are fighting for ending monarchy and stabilizing democracy." From a long discussion with him, I realized that now the Maoists were, and this was almost the ninth or eighth or ninth year of their People's War, that there is a war fatigue growing. Even if even if the Maoists win their People's War, the internal opinion in Nepal and the external friends like India or the US or anyone else would not let him survive in power as a revolutionary force. They have realized it, and therefore they wanted to come to terms with the democratic system and wanted to join the mainstream. Assuming that they want peace now and they want to join the mainstream, I started working with them. I never approved of their violence. I never approved of their harsher techniques, though I must tell you that out of the 18,000 or so Nepalese killed during the People's War, a greater responsibility lies with the state forces, particularly the royal forces, the Royal Nepal Army, of killing people. I've seen a couple of reports of the Nepal human rights groups saying that almost two-thirds of the killings were done by the army, one-third by the Maoists. And now there is a question of, justice and what you call, punishment to those who have committed the crime. And the whole blame is put on the Maoist, which as an academic I found was not very fair. Therefore, I was willing to help them, and somehow I got them in touch with the government and tried to explain that the Nepal Maoists were communists like anywhere else. And in fact, later on, my opinion was revised because they were even soft communists. They were the communists who were going to Pashupatinath temple. I mean, there is a contradiction in what it is. And you can see the reality now, how the Maoists have completely changed from what it is. They have completely dropped what their idea and vision of a new Nepal was. So this led me to get involved into the system. And they were also keen. Political parties were also very keen. That king was very harsh to them. King always wanted absolute powers. And there was time that Nepal now became a full democratic system, not being governed by the king. That made the political parties, mainstream political parties of Nepal and the Maoists come together. And it was facilitated by many in the government of India. Initially, they were very strongly hesitant about it. because the traditional Indian policy has been of supporting a constitutional monarchy in Nepal. The problem was that the constitutional monarch in Nepal never remained constitutional. It wanted to become autocrat since 1960, and there was this was in fact the monarchy which brought in the influences of Pakistan and China in a big way to counter their heavy dependence on India. So, if anybody has a greater responsibility in creating counterbalances for India and Nepal, it was the monarchy. So, at time, eventually they understood it. There was a lot of resistance, I can tell you, which is written in the book earlier, to accept the Maoist as part of the democratic system. But eventually they accepted, and this is how the change came about in 2006.
Thank you. Let us now turn our attention to the remarkable developments which have led to the adoption of a constitution in Nepal and the way it evolved with the constituent assemblies working successively. In August 2014, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi introduced his Neighbourhood First policy and paid a visit to Nepal, where he was invited to address the Constituent Assembly. He urged the Nepalese to craft a constitution resembling a bouquet of different flowers that accommodates the diverse communities and aspirations of its people, referring in particular to the status and rights of the Terai-based Madhesi people. Has this happened? How do you look back upon Nepal's constitutional experiment?
Look, the Neighbourhood First was introduced immediately after Prime Minister Modi coming to power. In fact, even during the campaign, some people, Natwar Singh and Raskotra, claimed that they had suggested to him that the neighbourhood policy needs to be revamped, because Dr. Manmohan Singh, though was very friendly with the neighbors, never visited any of the neighbors. So political contact at the highest level were not there. That made Prime Minister Modi to change this trend, and therefore he first went and addressed the Constituent Assembly of Nepal, where he, as you rightly said, presented a flower bouquet, where there are flowers of different color and different flavor put together. What he meant was that all the communities, and particularly there are three major communities in Nepal. One is called Khas area, which is of the middle hills, which is dominating there, which is almost 30% or so. Then there are tribal groups, which are also almost 1/3 of the country. And then there is a Tarai, which is also roughly 1/3, but sometimes they claim they are more than that. Whatever is, that is not important. These are the three main clusters in Nepal. But Khas area, the Middle Hill Kingdom, has Middle Hill upper caste people have always been dominating the Nepalese politics, and the tribals and the Madhesh people have been asking for their appropriate right in political system. That's where the question of a flower bouquet came up. What Prime Minister Modi meant was that all the groups should be brought in together. And a lot of effort was made. Nepali leaders were invited to India. They were requested, they were briefed why it would be good for Nepal. And somehow, theoretically, they accepted it. But when actual constitution making came, I think the Khas area, the dominant group, was not interested in sharing real power either with Madhesh or with the tribal groups. So they made a constitution in which most of the demands of the Madhesh and the tribal groups were ignored. That is where I think the fluctuations and diversions and distortions in Indian diplomacy started, because Prime Minister Modi then sent Jaishankar, who was then Foreign Secretary, as his special envoy, to tell the Nepalese people, that even Nepalese leaders, that even though the Constituent Assembly had accepted the constitution, the president should not sign it until a proper amendment is brought about to accommodate some of the demands. This Nepal took as an offense. This particularly the UML, the United Marxist-Leninist Communist Faction, which at that time was led by Mr. K.P. Oli, took it an exception. And I think every Nepali felt that it was uncalled for India to get into this. So they reacted and they did not accept it. As a result, India imposed certain economic coercion on them, which is regulating the flow of essential goods to Nepal. And it affected almost everyone in Nepal, including small children who could not go to school for months because there was no petrol and the buses could not take them there. There were no medicines for the older people there, no baby food easily available there. And that, I tell you, has created a very strong constituency of alienation from India. They call it anti-Indianism, which to some extent correct, but there is a deep alienation that India has been browbeating us unnecessarily. From that, the bad situation has started. The economic coercion forced the Nepali government to make some adjustment, but not to the full satisfaction of either the tribal groups or the Madhesh. And the political evolution in the course of time has totally fragmented both the Madhesh as well as the tribal groups, and the dominance of Khas Arya continues to be there despite the acceptance of federalism. So this is a very complicated story. Part of it I have written in the book, part of it I have somewhere else. But it is this which I think brought about a very serious hedge between India and Nepal politically, not socially, to some extent at the level of people also. So culturally, we are the same. Civilizationally, we may be the same, but politically, there is a very different attitude. And the Nepalese think that India is unduly transgressing on their identity, their sovereignty, their independence. India, on the other hand, thinks that what India was suggesting was in the best interest of Nepal, and they have not accepted it. So
Thank you.
obviously, there is a huge gulf of misunderstanding.
Thank you. Let us now turn our attention to Mr. Modi's, engagement with Nepal, deep engagement with Nepal. He has visited Nepal 5 times in the last 10 years. What are India's strategic aims vis-a-vis Nepal? With the expansion of China's influence through its Belt and Road Initiative, the standoff between India and China over Doklam, do you think that India would prefer Nepal to be a Hindu state and the monarchy to be restored as a kind of a reassurance vis-a-vis China?
Gyanesh, there are 2-3 issues involved. Number one, Prime Minister Modi's first visit was wonderful. Almost everybody hailed him like anything. Following that, the visits have always had some sort of a discomfort on both the sides. Because, as I said, the constitutional controversy had come up in between and this and that. So we have tried to raise assistance to Nepal. We have also tried to improve what I call normally the delivery deficiency of India's foreign policy. Whatever we promise, we cannot always deliver to them, and that creates a problem. India has tried to improve that in relation to all other neighbors, including Nepal to some extent, but we are still far away from a perfect situation in one way or the other. And the second issue, so one is of the bilateral relationship, which after 2015 got derailed, for which I think to some extent, to a very large extent, the Modi government's policy and diplomacy, despite Neighbourhood First, is responsible. And the second change which has come about is the imbalance between China and India. Now, Nepal, if you look into Nepal's history, Nepal has always leaned towards the stronger neighbor. There was a time when Nepal even had aggression on India and captured a lot of Indian territories in the, Uttaranchal, Himachal, and those areas, which the British pushed them out and they had to go back. They also had wars with Tibet and all that. So Nepal essentially has been, there are elements of expansionism so far as Nepal is concerned. And in that expansionism, the Nepalese rulers have said that we must maintain a perfect balance between the two bigger neighbors which we have. So they have always tilted towards the favorable balance. And now, as you know, the problem of India-Nepal relations, and I would say not only India-Nepal relations, India's relations with all other neighbors is this tilt in the balance, where China is far more powerful, economically far more generous than what India can do. I think structurally far more efficient than India delivers its own foreign policy. And therefore, the countries are leaning on China. Of all the South Asian countries, all of them are part of the BRI except Bhutan and India. And all of them are having economic ties, economic engagements with China. And they say that if India can have its heavy trade with China, and today, as you know, that China is India's first trading partner with almost 118 billion of trade. Both import and exports have grown in the last 2, 3, 4 years. From the time when during pandemic, India said that we want to reduce the dependence on China in one way or the other. Then the others are asking why they cannot have trade, why they cannot have assistance, why they cannot have Chinese economic involvement. And that somehow does not suit, because we know that the Chinese are coming economically with strategic objectives, and that would harm us. So there is a dilemma in terms of relationship with China, and a great deal of our neighborhood policy can be set right if this balance is corrected, which is not really seen in any short time. I may also say that China's builds and cashes on the alienation from India. So any neighbor which gets alienated from India, the Chinese are very quick to cash upon it. So I think this problem is looking bilateral, not only in relation to Nepal or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or even Bhutan. You would be surprised to know that Bhutan gets almost nearly 30% of its consumer goods which are Chinese. How do they come? They don't have a diplomatic relationship. They don't have a trade relationship. But these goods come to third countries from, say, Thailand, Southeast Asia, somewhere else, from Dubai. In various ways it comes about. So we must accept that this is a reality, that China is going to stay in South Asia. Now, if China is going, because China has its own interest, and somewhere I have written there are 4 strong drivers for China. First, they have the problem of Tibet and Xinjiang, and all these South Asian countries are neighboring them. So in order to stabilize them, they need cooperation of the South Asian countries. Then South Asian market is the world's biggest market in a way, because we are 1.6 billion people growing at an average rate of 5%, which is highest in the world today. So potential is huge. Immediately, the middle class may still be growing gradually, but still 500 billion dollar, 500 billion of the middle class, 600 billion of the middle class in all of South Asia. I'm not only talking of India, which is growing. So how can China ignore that material? It will that market. It will not ignore. That's why the Chinese, through BRI and various other methods, not all over the world, I am focusing on South Asia. They want to connect with the South Asian market and build the South Asian market, so that they can have their surplus capacities invested into this market. So they have huge economic interest. They have huge maritime interest now, and they are scared that India and US together will constrain them in Asia. Therefore, they don't want Indian and US influence to be strengthened in their South Asian periphery. So these are the four drivers which are on India. And today, if any South Asian country tells to China, no, no, don't come, the Chinese would not stop. They'll find other ways to come in. So this regional geopolitics has become very complicated and somehow not favoring India at this stage unless we put our house together in terms of building comprehensive national strength, not militarily, not only maritime, not only economic, but in almost every respect of the term. And added to this is that we must be very cautious in curbing alienation of our neighbors. Somehow we must accept their sensitivities. Look at India's foreign policy, Gyanesh. They devote so much of time on China, US, Europe, Southeast Asia.
Yes.
So far as
Yes.
neighbors concerned, this is a crisis investment. Whenever there is a crisis, we of course completely get seized of it. Like in Maldives recently, we saw that. Sri Lanka earlier, we saw that. Nepal constitution time, we saw that. This would not help. I think we will have to do a lot of restructuring. And I may quote Jaishankar to support my point. When in December 2023, he went to Nepal, while coming back in a press conference, he said that we have to rethink and readjust our neighborhood first policy in order to win the neighbors.
Thank you so much. This really gives a wonderful insight into the geopolitics of the neighborhood, South Asian neighborhood, India's neighborhood, and of course the dynamics between India and China as it operates in the South Asian countries. Now, this, I think our readers have got a wonderful sense about what your book is about, what are the main contents, the main themes which you have taken up, drawing upon your very rich experience as a diplomat and of course as a professor of international studies. So thank you so much for being with us in this afternoon session, in this podcast. And this brings us, we thank you very warmly. And this brings us to the close. You were listening to the South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Thank you.